just want to welcome everyone on behalf of Patricia Bacdano Lopez and the staff at the Center for Latino Policy Research. We're really happy and delighted to have Professor Robert Fairlie, who's an economist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he's currently professor at the Department of Economics and also director of the master's program in applied economics and finance at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He has various research area interests that are common to the center, and these are entrepreneurship, labor economics, technology, public policy, race, and ethnicity. And I first met Dr. Fairlie at meetings about the digital divide at the Center for Justice and Tolerance, founded by another colleague, economist, Manuel Pastor. And so now we meet here again at the Center for Latino Policy Research Center because we're delighted to have him here because of his extensive knowledge of the field itself of entrepreneurship, but also this is the knowledge of econometrics and his experience in quantitative data analysis that he's using and applying to test certain hypotheses in the literature that might explain wealth inequality, in particular wealth inequality indicators amongst Mexican Americans, and more specifically small business owners. We find that we share a lot of intellectual concern and interest in public policy agendas, and the reason why we're happy and engaged that he's in these questions is because the center supports the advancement of academic research that is engaged in inquiry that can explain policy-related questions in the areas of education from K through 12, higher education, immigration, and now we have the digital divide. We've also done a lot of work on civic engagement and political participation. We are also engaged in, I think one of our shared values or interests is that we're engaged in inequality studies that provide insight about inequality itself, or what the empirical record has proven explains some of these social and economic indicators, outcomes. So at CLPR, we're really interested in uncovering development mechanisms that support high road development trajectories for Latinos to advance in basically higher income, high skilled jobs, and anything that generates wealth. So we're really happy that you're here at this time because to have this dialogue with our audience, because we know that it's an important topic today to try to understand why there is a low Mexican American entrepreneurial benefit. His talk today is on Mexican American entrepreneurship, and he's using the U.S. Census decennial data, some very detailed CPS data, and more than other data sets that he'll discuss with you today. But this is important for the context of policy today. In California, we have a fiscal crisis, and we also are making decisions about who gets to have the certain resources that are required to attain a certain level of education. So we're making decisions about where there's definitely cuts, I think a lot of cuts that affect the types of resources that are available to provide the types of learning and education opportunities that are offered for Latinos through the public education system. There's also some discussion on immigration policies, and in particular, once in a while there's historical moments where we pass immigration reform acts and we decide who we legalize. There's a lot of questions about who do we legalize, who's the kind of person that we would make amendments to. So I have a lot of really interesting questions that I find interesting that I hope we can engage in as you present. And I just want to welcome Robert Fairlie to our center, and we're happy that he's here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to talk at the center. I'm actually very interested in this topic because of these ideas about inequality. And entrepreneurship is seen as sort of anti-inequality, but you'll see that it really is, right? It depends on who's actually being an entrepreneur and how successful those businesses are. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in. I'll talk through more about that. I should mention that my co-author is Chris Woodruff. He's down at UC San Diego, and he's also really interested in these types of topics, and he's done a lot of research in Mexico, actually. And I'll talk a little bit about some joint work that he and I have done where we've looked at both Mexico and US data. But as Blanca says, I do a lot of quantitative work, so I hope not to, there'll be a lot of numbers that I'll show, but I'll try to kind of really talk through them and what I'm doing carefully to get at kind of the key points. So maybe this isn't something I need to spend too much time, but I like to talk about, these issues about immigration and changes in demographics, especially to a lot of economists who really don't know that much about what's happening because they don't look at the data on racial trends and immigrant trends. But Mexican Americans now represent almost 10% of the US population. And if you look at the trends that are happening right now, and if they continue, Mexican Americans will be the single largest ethnic or racial group in the US within a decade, or maybe sooner. And roughly 2/3 of working age Mexican Americans are immigrants. Okay, so they're born outside of the US. And another thing that's interesting here is that it is becoming much more well known about sort of economic outcomes of Mexican immigrants. And there's sort of this active debate about the assimilation of Mexican immigrants in the US economy. Okay, so there's been a lot of research on other immigrant groups and their assimilation, but I would say that the biggest wave of research now by economists is looking at Mexican immigrants because of the size of the immigrant population and concerns about education and earnings. Okay. Now, so there's this new literature. It's an emerging literature in economics that looks at why Mexican Americans have lower wages, lower incomes, lower wealth, lower education levels, lower other economic outcomes. But what's really interesting, though, is there's very little research that's done on business ownership and performance. And I will give you, a quick review of literature, which won't take me more than 30 seconds because there's so little that's been done on this. But as I'll show you, I think business ownership and performance, these are very important issues that are related to inequality. They're related to assimilation. They're very important in terms of kind of our overall economic well-being. So if you think about business ownership, it's the main alternative to wage and salary work to make a living. Okay, so most people do go out and work wage and salary workers, but business ownership is the next kind of alternative to that. Self-employed business owners are found to earn more on average than wage and salary workers. And this pattern holds for every industry that you can look at when you look at very detailed data from the census. So each of these dots here represents a different industry. So this would be something like owning a restaurant or having a taxi cab service. This is the average wage and salary earnings in that industry, and this is the average self-employed business earnings in that industry. And this purple line here is the 45-degree line. So anything above the 45-degree line means that on average, self-employed business owners earn more in that specific industry than wage and salary workers do. Okay? And what you find is that this is for men. For almost every industry you see that business owners make more on average than wage and salary earners.
What are the top?
I'm not sure. It's probably it's a professional, so it's probably professional. So physicians, it could be physicians actually, or maybe a specific type of physician.
Okay.
So relative to wage and salary, right? If you're doing your own business, then you're earning more. And look at for women, it's very similar, right? For almost every industry, female business owners make more than female wage and salary workers. So, clearly this has implications for inequality, right? If the self-employed business owners are making more on average than wage and salary workers.
Is this data national?
That is all national.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So everything I'm going to talk about today is national. None of it is focused on regional differences. So we're really going to exploit the larger sample sizes that are, the full census. And by the way, I didn't mention this in the beginning of the talk, but definitely feel free to interrupt me as I go along because that's sort of the economic style. And I was telling Blanca earlier that often you don't even get through a seminar, but that's not that uncommon actually. Most of our seminars at the end, the last 5 minutes is someone pushing the page down button to try to get through. But anyway, yeah, so definitely interrupt me if you want clarifying questions or just want to talk about something more. So self-employed business owners, they have higher savings rates, they accumulate more wealth, so there are studies that have shown that. And a really interesting statistic that I found recently is that they represent less than 12% of the total population, but hold nearly 40% of all wealth, of all U.S. wealth, is held by this 12% of the population that owns businesses. So clearly it's important for wealth accumulation. There's a couple of studies that have used kind of more detailed longitudinal data and have shown that it also looks like it's useful for economic advancement. So I have a study where I found that there's faster earnings growth over time for young people who started businesses than those who started wage and salary work. But it took a couple of years, right? There were these initial years of low earnings, and then after that is when you see the faster earnings growth. Then if you look at a relatively poor population like Mexican immigrants in the US overall, what you find is that those Mexican immigrants who own businesses, they have a nearly 3 times higher rate of earning more than $50,000. So 50,000 is not a magic number or anything, I just wanted to come up with some kind of benchmark. So they're 3 times more likely to earn $50,000 or more than wage and salary workers. So in other words, it's very hard for a Mexican immigrant to earn more than $50,000 if they're a wage and salary worker. But if they're a business owner, they own their own business, they're much more likely to do that. 3 times more likely to hit that earnings level. Okay. What's that?
I'm like, that hard?
Yeah. And so there's also a lot of historical research talking about the success of earlier immigrant groups in the U.S. In terms of their use of business ownership. So there are a number of studies that have looked at the Chinese, Japanese immigrants, and more recent studies that have looked at Korean immigrants as using business ownership as kind of their main form of getting ahead of having economic advancement. Finally, another kind of key argument here is that business ownership is very useful for job creation and economic development in poor neighborhoods. Okay, so if you think about creating jobs in kind of poor communities, business ownership is one way to do it. Now, so all of those arguments taken together, clearly there's a lot of motivation for studying entrepreneurship or business ownership. But another thing is, kind of a more basic idea in economics is if we want to understand how liquidity constraints, maybe informational barriers or lending discrimination, customer discrimination, or any other kind of barrier that constrains business ownership among any group is a problem, right? It's a problem because it creates inefficiency in the economy. This is more kind of like, taking a step back and just thinking more carefully about, is the U.S. economy efficient? Well, maybe it's not if we've got all these constraints that are limiting the creation of businesses among certain groups in our population. And especially among minority groups like Mexican immigrants, who are a fast-growing part of the population. This is even more important, right? That we worry about what effect it has on U.S. productivity overall. So that's kind of more the sort of real kind of fundamental economic argument here. And so the goals are related to that. In this paper, we want to explore why Mexican Americans have low business formation rates, ownership rates, and own what I'll call our underperforming businesses, and I'll define that later on. But basically, Mexican Americans, I'm going to show you, are less likely to start businesses. The businesses they do start are less successful. They're not performing as well. And so we want to test kind of 3 main hypotheses related to these kind of overall questions. One is it due to human capital constraints, right? Are human capital constraints a big explanation for why Mexican Americans form fewer businesses and their businesses are lower performing? So are lower education levels limiting? Are English language issues another important one? We want to find out if that's the case. There's some work done by Steve Trejo. He used to be at UC Santa Barbara, actually, now at University of Texas. And what he found is that lower education levels and English language ability were very important, were the 2 most important factors for lower earnings in Mexican American wage and salary workers. We don't know if that's also true for self-employed business owners, okay? And so that's one of the questions we want to test, is what he found for the wage and salary workers is also true for business owners. Now, what about a different issue is you need capital to start a business. So what about limited access to financial capital? Does that constrain Mexican Americans from starting businesses? And also the businesses that they do start, if they're undercapitalized, then they won't be as successful. And if you look at the median net worth of Mexican Americans in the US, it's only slightly more than $6,000. Right? So that means you add up all the assets that Mexican Americans own on the middle person, so the 50th ranked person, and then subtract off all the debt, and that person has $6,000. Okay, that's extremely low, right? I mean, that's like the value of a used car.
Right.
And what's interesting is that's very similar to African Americans. And there's a whole lot more literature that's looked at African Americans, and I've written a couple of papers and a book on this, and it found that that is a big reason why African Americans are less likely to start businesses, and the businesses they own are less successful, because they have very low levels of wealth, and that wealth is not being translated into investment capital for the business. Now, another issue that's really interesting for Mexican immigrants is legal status. If you look at what the Census Bureau and one of these studies, it is from the INS, they both estimate that there are at least 10 million Mexican immigrants in the U.S. who are undocumented. So about 50% of all Mexican immigrants in the U.S. are undocumented. Okay, so those are very difficult estimates to come up with, obviously, right? But there's no disagreement that there is a sizable population. And so the interesting question then is, does legal status affect, or the lack of legal status affect the formation of businesses and whether or not those businesses are successful? So there's sort of two sides to this, right? Legal status, first of all, increases earnings. There's evidence of that in the literature. And if it increases earnings, that's sort of an opportunity cost of starting a business. If I can do well in the wage and salary sector, then maybe I'm less likely to start a business. But on the other hand, so it could actually reduce entrepreneurship. But on the other hand is, if you have legal status, then you can get government contracts, you can get loans, you have access to many more institutions than you would have otherwise. You have access to the legal system in case there are any kind of disputes that come up with your business. So there are these sort of two offsetting factors, and we don't know which of those is going to be outweigh the other.
Or there's an additional dynamic that happened on the legal side. It came true in California. I'm not sure if other states did the same thing, but as a result of the Welfare Reform Act, where there was an identification of non-eligible immigrants, what Pete Wilson did in California was he had his administration issue a series of executive orders that limited the opportunities of people without documentation to obtain professional licenses, for example. Those are still on the books. So basically, somebody who could become a barber on day one could not be a barber on day two.
I see.
For example, that was back in 1998, I think, maybe earlier than 1996. No, it was 98. It was after the welfare reform.
Yeah, that could be
explore what effect that might have. What other states did the same thing.
Yeah, no, that could be another constraint then for starting a business. Although that also could work for the wage and salary sector too, right?
Right.
So it's not clear exactly which way it would go, but that could be another important issue in all of that. So another thing that we're going to do in this paper is we're going to use a lot of data. So many different data sets, and I'll talk through them as I kind of go along, but the 1980, 90, and 2000 census population files, those are the large ones that have 15 million observations each. Then we're going to take all the current population surveys from 94 to 2004 that have immigrant questions on them, because they only started that in 94. Then we're going to do something that's very different, which is we match the CPS and create panel data out of it, which is kind of unusual. You can take 1 year of the CPS and match 50% of the people to the next year, so you get a 2-year panel. So it's a short panel, but at least it's it's longitudinal data. You have 2 observations for each person. The legalized population survey, this is something that the Department of Labor put together to study the effects of IRCA. So I'm going to talk about that, and then the NLSY is another study that we're going to use. So our goal is to provide a comprehensive analysis of this issue, but I guess nothing is really comprehensive. But at least, sort of from the quantitative point of view, we're going to try to use as many large data sets as we can to look at this. So as I mentioned before, the previous literature won't take me very long to go through because it is so limited. There really are only a couple of studies that have looked at business ownership among Mexican Americans. And I think it's surprising because there's such an extensive literature that's looked at African Americans. And that literature shows that education, wealth, parental self-employment, lending constraints, consumer discrimination, that those are kind of the important factors limiting African Americans in terms of successful business ownership. And it's surprising because Mexican American business ownership rates are only slightly higher than African Americans, and I'll show you that in a second. And the businesses are not performing, they're performing better, but not that much better. Lobstrom and Wang, they have a paper that recently came out. They show that relatively low levels of education and wealth seem to be two of the most important factors limiting Mexican American business formation rates. And a paper that Chris and I wrote earlier where we used data from Mexico and the US and did this kind of comparison from the two census files, we found that education was an important factor, but we didn't find that low rates of business ownership in Mexico were a factor at all. If anything, what we found is that that about a quarter of the population of Mexico owns a business or reports owning a business. That's actually one of the highest business ownership rates in the world. Okay, if you look at, kind of cross-country level data, you'll find that Mexico is, is near the top end. And that's not just looking at agriculture. I mean, that's actually, we pulled out agriculture because we had the micro data.
In terms of representation of self-employment?
Yeah, in terms of the population. So the fact that 1/4 of the population owns a business.
Is that because
extremely high.
that they own the business? Or I was just wondering if it's because of the informality of the economy.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. You definitely tend to see higher rates of business ownership in developing countries. Well, certainly Europe, a lot of those countries have very low rates of business ownership.
Yeah, because the economies are different, or the participation, it's not comparative, do you think? Well, it gives you
It's not a
insight,
fair,
yeah.
I agree, it's not a fair comparison. But I guess the thing we were interested in is if Mexican immigrants come from a country where it's very low business ownership rate, formal or informal, then that could help explain why the rates are low in the US. But that's just not the case, right? Now maybe it is a lot of informal businesses that can't be translated here, although it's not clear that's true, right? I mean,
Well, it'd be interesting to note that, what's the kind of, how does their human capacity or their entrepreneurial skill set, however it comes, informal or informal, or formal, translate in a different context, under a different economy with a totally different legal structure that would sustain that.
That's where actually some nice qualitative work would really help fill that out.
Of course, then there's the question of the informal sector in the United States, in that there are a number of people operating small-scale business operations under the radar. They don't have business licenses, they're not paying business taxes, so they don't appear in the U.S. statistics because they're not reported as business.
Well, the data I'm going to go through that carefully because that's really important here.
Okay.
I would say we're capturing a fair amount of that.
Okay.
And I can show you the industry breakouts, but it's still not the big picture of what I'm going to show. But that's true. That's another issue is sort of, what is this kind of going under the radar? So
in the data set that, for the IRCA, that data set, do they then ask the questions about their status previous to that? I mean, obviously everybody legalized then, but I was just wondering, how do you?
So it's people who applied for legal status.
Right.
So they're in the data set, and then the legalized population survey follows them for 4 years.
Okay.
I'll talk more about that data set definitely when I get to the undocumented part.
There's another potential data set here, and I don't know if you took a look at it or whether it had this kind of data, but when the binational study was done during the Barbara Jordan Commission in the United States, there were a team of researchers binationally, both Mexico and the United States, that took a look at a range of issues related to migration and immigration, the circumstances of immigrants in both Mexico, from the point of origin as well as the community reception here in the U.S. There might be some stuff in there that might speak to some of these issues. And of course, people like Doug Massey in, where is he now? Is he in Pennsylvania?
Maybe at Princeton.
He's at Princeton. That's right, he's at Princeton. He was in Pennsylvania, but he's in Princeton. And he has a counterpart who's sitting around that's in Guadalajara. I think they've done some of this stuff.
Uh-huh.
Just for the future, if you
Yeah.
haven't thought about it.
Well, I've looked at some of the work that he's done. Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I need to look at it more carefully. But I know that one of the surveys they did was a snowball sample where they kind of followed people. We didn't look at carefully at that as we need to look at that more. So anyway, there's no kind of comprehensive analysis of Mexican American entrepreneurship. It just really hasn't been done in the literature. And again, it's kind of surprising, right, given that there's so much other research on other immigrant groups, previous immigrant groups, and also African Americans. So what is self-employed business ownership? So this is actually pretty important, right, in this context, especially when we're talking about these rates of business ownership in Mexico and thinking about, people coming to the U.S. So it's based on the class of worker question. So that's kind of the standard question that you find in the census or the current population survey. And it refers to the respondent's main job or business activity. So this would be like the activity with the most hours. So if someone had 2 or 3 jobs, whatever job has the most hours is considered their main job. If they run a business and they work as a wage and salary worker, so say a professor has a consulting business, then that person's going to report that they're a wage and salary worker. They're a professor first and the consulting's on the side. So the self-employed then, we define them as the individuals report, and this is the actual question on the census, one of the possible responses. Are you self-employed in your own non-incorporated business, professional practice, or farm? And then self-employed in own incorporated business, professional practice, or farm. Those are the two. So incorporated or unincorporated businesses. Incorporated businesses overall are about 30% of the population, and that's actually been growing over time. And it's sort of like an advantage, tax.
But it doesn't desegregate the question, huh? It's just
No, we can. And we've done a little bit with that, but a lot of it is not as interesting for kind of the first cut, right? Because there can be some very, very successful non-incorporated businesses, right? You don't necessarily need to incorporate to be successful. And it's more just about taxes.
Is there, I was just thinking in terms of
Liability.
collecting data with people who wouldn't want to report that out of fear that, they're not paying taxes. But I don't know because they're not legal business. Does that include the informal description? Like, does that?
No, this is it. So they're either going to say this or they work for an employer.
Is it?
Or they can work for the government, they can work for a private employer, or they would report one of these two. And so what we do is we take these types of, this classification for that question. So business ownership here then is going to refer to all types, including incorporated, unincorporated. It's going to include employer firms and non-employer firms. Unfortunately, the census does not ask a question about that, whether or not you have an employee or not. But you can see that some informal types of businesses might slip through the cracks, right? They wouldn't be reported in this case, but a lot of them, would be because they would consider themselves as self-employed business owners. So what we did is we wanted to look through the industries very carefully to see, how much of this problem is out there based on how someone reports their industry. Okay, so this table's first for men, and then I'll show you one for women. So the most common self-employed industry in the U.S. in terms of the percent of all self-employed male business owners is about 24% are in construction. So that's a big industry with a lot of business owners. Okay, so that's clearly the biggest one for men. Then it really gets spread out after that. So construction is the major one. You see a lot of men own auto repair stores, legal services, some agriculture, truck transportation. There's just a number of different types of businesses that are out there, and it's pretty spread across. Now, we're also really worried about these types of businesses that you might consider as not really business ownership, in the sense that they don't have a lot of potential for growth, they don't have a lot of potential for employment. And one of them you might worry about are cleaners, right? So private household services. But you can see that that's only 0.2% of men, of all male self-employed. So cleaners can't be a big issue for men. We were worried about, child care services, which could pick up nannies, babysitters. That's another non-issue for men. Taxi drivers was one that we were really worried about. So there's some parts of the taxi driver that seem like a business, right? Because they have to purchase a medallion, so they have to come up with some capital for that. But there are other parts about how they work for one cab company, usually, in most cities, that don't seem like a business, right? They seem more like an employee, but just kind of with this weird arrangement about how they get their job. And so that one should be 0.7, yeah, so that's almost 1%. So what we're going to do is we go through and do all of our results throwing out those industries, right? The cleaners, babysitters, taxi drivers, to make sure our results are not sensitive to those industries that you might think of as not really being real business ownership. I mean, they are business ownership, but it's a different kind of term. And for women, you can kind of see the biggest industries. So childcare services is one of the bigger ones, 11%. Beauty salons, 7.8%. Real estate. Here's cleaners, right, 5%. So these two industries here we're a little bit concerned about because that's 15% of all female businesses in the U.S. And they're very low earning, right? These are the lowest earning industries. Although what you find is that it's still comparable to wage and salary work. Remember I showed you before that all the self-employed industries earn more than wage and salary. So there are very few that don't. But anyway, we're going to do some sensitivity checks with that. And what we find is that the results are not sensitive to whether or not we throw those out. Okay, so now let me just get to some of the estimates of business ownership. This shows you business ownership rates by ethnicity and race for men. So what it's telling you is what percent of the working population owns a business. So for white non-Latinos, it's almost 13%. So 13% of the workforce owns a business. Okay. And what you find is for African Americans it's 4.4, for Mexican Americans it's 5.1. Okay. This estimate here, the fact that it's so low, is often hidden in government statistics. Okay. The reason is that there is no Mexican American category, it's Latino. Mm-hmm. And what you find is that other Latino groups, especially Cubans, have much higher rates. Okay. And so that average gets pulled up. Although still, it's not like, these are still not real high rates of business ownership. And you can see Native Americans are kind of comparable to other. And then Asian groups have, there's a lot of heterogeneity in Asian groups, but for the most part have pretty high rates of business ownership. Okay, so those are sort of the ethnic differences. The patterns are almost identical for women. It's just much lower. Lower rates of business ownership for all groups for women. Okay. So on average, women have lower rates of business ownership, and you can see that 6.6% of white non-Latino women own a business or in the workforce, and for Mexican Americans, it's 2.6. So for both men and women, there are striking differences between non-Latino white rates of business ownership and Mexican American business ownership rates. Okay, and the national average is what we're kind of interested in making a comparison to, is very close to this rate up here. So Mexican Americans are much lower than the national average, if you want to think of it that way. And they're only slightly higher for men and women than African American rates, which again has kind of garnered a lot of attention in the literature. Okay. Now one thing that's very interesting about Mexican Americans is we've got this kind of generational changes. And with the current population survey, we're actually able to look at first, second, and third generation. So third generation here actually is third and higher. So first generation means you're born in Mexico. Second generation means that one of your parents or both of your parents are born in Mexico. Third generation is that it's a little vaguer of a definition, but someone will report that they have Mexican American ancestry, but they were not born in Mexico, and neither of their parents were born in Mexico. So they could be third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation. And what we're worried about is there could also be some slippage there where, some Mexican Americans by that generation will report that they're Mexican American or not. It's not as clear, right? It's not as objective as a measure as the first or second, where we just look at the birthplace of themselves or their parent. Anyway, the interesting question here then is, do we see progress, right? So you've got low rates of business ownership among Mexican Americans overall, But do we see progress across generations? And what we find is there's very little, right? For men, it goes from 4.9 to 5.3 and 5.2. So there's almost no progress here in terms of business ownership rates. For women, we see a similar pattern. It really does not increase substantially with generations. And this is kind of interesting because, your first reaction would be, what's going on? Why isn't it increasing? Because I'll show you some other factors that do increase, like education increases a lot from first to second generation. But business ownership is kind of interesting because immigrants actually have higher business ownership rates overall. So if you look at whites, for example, what you find is the first generation has the highest rate of business ownership. It actually goes down over time. So there are kind of these different patterns that are happening here.
Is there distinctions in also in the human capital by generations in your sample?
Yeah, I'm going to show you. Yeah, human capital changes a lot.
And how does that compare to half the trajectory for African Americans comparatively? I mean, I know that it's distinct and, well, I guess you would both look at those indicators of human capital. I'm just interested, how does that pattern compare to?
I don't think I have a table with the education slide. Yeah, I don't know.
So I imagine if you're going to look at African immigrants.
If you want to look at generational, then they're very different groups.
Well,
right?
There's the immigrants from Africa, there's the immigrants from Europe who are African, and there are the Caribbean African immigrants, and each of them kind of has their own unique characteristics.
Yeah, so the African American population is going to be relatively small in the first generation, and then there will be very few on the second generation. Obviously, it's going to be more third and higher. We didn't really look at that.
Do you isolate for Black Latinos? Is it race? Do you disaggregate at that level?
We're defining Mexican Americans based on where they say they're born. So I think, I'm not sure. I know I've looked at Latino and race, and there you find Puerto Ricans, but even still, a small number are saying they're Black. I mean, they're mainly saying that they're not. They're other race. It seems to be a popular one now. White or other race. With Mexican Americans, I think it's a pretty small number are saying they're Black. Very, very, very small.
You're expecting the rate to go down for non-Latino whites. Why do you expect the rate to go up for Mexican Americans?
Yeah, so that's kind of the interesting thing here, right? Is that your first reaction would be it should go up. It's very low relative to the national average. As this, as Mexican Americans or Mexican American groups have more time in the U.S., have a higher education, we'd expect it to go up. But wait a minute, you got to think more carefully about this because the immigrant groups generally have higher business ownership rates than second or third generation. So it's not entirely clear what we'd expect this to do. But clearly there is no generational change. So we're kind of, this is more exploratory research. We weren't really sure what we were going to find on that.
When you were exploring that, did you also consider like the generations, but also the time of length of time of being an entrepreneur in terms of experience?
Well, so that's one of the factors that's actually going to be pretty important for some of the later stuff I'll talk about. But the time that you personally are in the U.S. is very important. That goes up very quickly for first generation. Right? You see, someone who's there only 1 year or 2 years, their business ownership rate is going up very rapidly. As they stay here 5, 10 years, it's going up constantly. So that actually is pretty important. And we're going to try to control for that in some of the work that I'll show you. Another thing that we did too that I don't have time to go through with the tables is we also were worried about cohort changes. So Mexican immigrants coming in the 70s, are they different than the 80s or 90s, in the early 2000s? And we didn't really find any evidence of that. All the business ownership rates for Mexican immigrants were low. There wasn't like a cohort that looked really good relative to the other cohorts. I mean, it just was very similar kind of patterns of low business ownership. So we're going to think of business outcome measures as business ownership, which I've shown you a bit, business formation, and business performance. But if you think about this kind of carefully, business ownership is really created by two dynamic factors. One is what's the rate of business formation? Like how many people are creating businesses? Okay, that speed of business creation affects how many people actually own a business at a point in time. And then business performance obviously is really important, right? If the businesses that are being formed are not doing well, then they'll go out of business and they'll be gone. And so you need these kind of two things, right? You need a high business formation rate and you need businesses to do well to kind of get that level of business ownership up. And you see with Mexican Americans that overall, we're talking about say 4.5% relative to 12%. Well, what I'm going to show you is that that's basically due to two factors. The first is that Mexican Americans have very low rates of business formation. So this is the annual business formation rate. So what it's saying is that anywhere from say 2 to say 2.5% of Mexican Americans will start a business each year. That's a lot lower than 3.5%, which is what you find for non-Latino whites, or kind of the national average. Okay, so Mexican Americans are much less likely to start a business in any given year. Then, if you look at the exits, how many leave, you find these very, very high rates of exit. So 34% for first generation, almost 50% for the second generation, 30% for the third generation. Okay. Now what's happening is the sample sizes are getting a little smaller here, so we've got to be kind of careful. But I would say, this would be about 35%. Over a third of Mexican Americans leave business ownership each year, whereas for non-Latino whites, it's about 22%. Okay.
What's the time frame?
1 year. It's a 1 year window, because that's all we can do with the current population survey. So these are the special data that I mentioned where we took 1 year of the CPS and matched it to the other year.
In your panel, do you ask the question of how long it's been in existence? So that if you isolate for how long?
No, the CPS does not ask that, unfortunately. Yeah, that would be a nice thing to know.
So are we to interpret the percentage of business ownership by white non-Latinos to be the fact that this is the accumulation of business over time, because clearly the formation rate isn't that much more.
But it is. It is though, because even though it doesn't look that different, think of it as in terms of a ratio.
Right.
So 3.3 relative to say 2.2 or 3 is a lot bigger, right? It's a lot bigger. It's a lot faster.
But still, there's a larger base that's been accumulated over time. I'm talking about the 14% number.
Yeah.
The 90,616.
So what you can do, kind of mathematically, it's not too difficult, but you can kind of figure out how much of these differences are due to the entry and the exit, and it's about half and half. So the reason Mexican Americans then are less likely to own businesses, just in general, is because they're less likely to start businesses. That's about half the story. And second, they're more likely to leave business ownership, to exit. Okay, that's the other half of the story. So it's these two factors that are both working against them. And so what we're going to do is look at these things much more carefully, the dynamic parts. Yeah.
One quick question, that would be with respect to those businesses that leave, how do we know that they're not engaged in successorship?
So one thing I got to be careful about is calling exit a measure of performance. There's some good research that actually looks at this pretty carefully and finds that I think it's 20 to 30% of closures on businesses are actually successful ones. Exits are successful ones. They sell the business, or they find a wage and salary job that's just much better. So the business experience they got was useful to get them a higher paid job. So yeah, we got to be careful. We can't necessarily call this a negative, but definitely the business ownership is being affected by. I mean, that's a mechanical relationship, basically.
Is there a distinction? I mean, obviously, if you have less capital, then you're less likely to be able to have the kind of assistance to develop the business.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a distinction too, did you find in the comparative between whites and Mexicans in terms of how many employees they have in their sample?
We don't have data on that from this study, but I have looked at that in other data sets.
What do you find? Similar pattern?
No, many fewer employees. Lower sales, fewer employees, lower profit levels, and higher closure rates. Yeah, so these data, these kind of more individual level household survey data are showing very similar patterns. And the issue there is the only way you can get access to those micro data, because they're basically from IRS tax records, is you have to apply for it. It's very difficult to do. It takes a long time. So we would have liked to look at those data also, but it would have been very, very difficult to get access to it. But that could be like a future project on the road. Okay, so given that exits aren't necessarily the best measure that we think of performance, what is the measure that we prefer? One of the things we have is net business income, subtracting out expenses. So the census asks for your business, what's your business income? Subtracting out your expenses. And so we can compare that. And what you find here is pretty interesting. For non-Latino white men, on average, male business owners make about $64,000 a year. Okay. For Mexican immigrants, it's less than half of that, or it's about half that, $32,000. Okay. What's interesting here too, again, is thinking about the literature more generally. That's actually lower than it is for African Americans. Okay, so Mexican immigrant business owners are actually making less money in their businesses, and second or third generation Mexicans who own businesses are only making slightly more. Okay, at $45,000, but they're still substantially lower. Now with the census data, we can't distinguish between second and third generation anymore. We can only look at U.S. born. And you see similar patterns for women, for female business owners. Right? The businesses make less money, right? But you see these racial patterns come up, where Mexican immigrants are the lowest earning group in business ownership, and then Mexican U.S. born, and then African American.
Even looking at that, do you look at like the difference that might explain that in type of businesses they run?
Yeah, I'll show you that, because that's so your first reaction might be, well, if they own different types of businesses. Yeah, and I'll show you that industry is somewhat of the story for women, but it's not for men. And I would, that's actually a really interesting question. I want to talk about that more carefully later, which I will. Okay, so what drives these major differences? So with our data, we can look at a number of factors. There's certainly some things that we can't look at, but one of them is education, right? We have good measures of education in our data. You might think that major educational differences could explain why Mexican Americans have lower business formation rates, and why their businesses don't perform as well on average. So if you look at, we broke this out like very, very detailed education levels. So we have graduate degree, bachelor's, associate, some college, 0 to 6, 7 to 8 years of education. And we did it for 4 groups. We have white non-Latinos, would be the blue one. And Mexican first generation is the reddish one. Then it goes to second generation, third generation. And so what you see is there are a lot of first generation immigrants with extremely low levels of education, right? 0 to 6 years. And then also a lot in this first generation that have, basically less than a high school degree. Then what happens is you jump to the second generation, and there's a huge improvement, right? This whole distribution of education is shifting over. Okay. And then third generation, a real puzzle in the literature actually is, why doesn't it increase even more? Why isn't it getting closer to the national average, which is close to the blue? Okay. And what's created here then is that Mexican immigrants have much lower level of education. Their distribution of education is far to the left from the national average. And then second generation, it makes a big jump, but it's still a lot lower. Look at graduate degrees, right? We're finding in the second and third generation that it's only a third of the national average, right? I mean, these are not new statistics. I'm not, this is nothing new. A lot of you probably know these statistics well, but they're pretty glaring, right? The educational differences at the bachelor degree level, the graduate level degree, associates and this kind of some college level are pretty sizable.
It looks like it's declining, so it has
Oh, it does. It goes down a little, but it's not you're
But
not
it's
getting.
not going up, it's going down a little bit, even if it's a little.
Oh, where's the decline? You want it to decline on this half.
Yeah.
You want it to not decline on this half.
But when you compare the generation from second to third,
Yeah, a little drop there, but this one's gone up a little. Not much.
there's 1%.
Yeah, it represents 1%. So yeah, I mean it's really small, and that's sort of a puzzle and why that's not happening. But anyway, these differences in education, these much lower levels of education among all three generations of Mexican Americans, could translate into lower business formation rates and lower performing businesses. The previous literature on business ownership shows that those are two very important factors. Okay, and what I'm going to do is use a method that's pretty popular in labor economics, which is a decomposition technique. So this was pioneered by a paper by Alan Blinder. He was the head of the Fed way back when, and Ron Oaxaca. And they came up with this way of sort of decomposing these changes. So the basic idea, I won't go through all the math, it's pretty ugly. You can see a lot of math. I have to put this on here, right? It's an economics topic. But basically the idea is you want to know these education differences, right? How much of the gap in business formation or business performance is due to the fact that Mexican American groups have lower levels of education? I want to assign a number to it. I want to be able to say 10% is due to education. I want to be able to say 10% is due to wealth. Okay, I want to be able to partition it out and be able to say, what are these relative contributions from all these factors? How much can education explain? How much can wealth explain? How much can age differences explain? How much do regional differences explain? Okay, so that's kind of the goal. The decomposition technique, I can tell you a lot more about it. One thing that's nice is that Stata, anyone here use Stata at all? Stata actually has a procedure now called the Fairlie procedure, which is kind of my only claim to fame. Yeah, I hope so. Where you can run this without, unfortunately, without knowing that much about what it means. But yeah, you can just run it all in Stata. And then I have all the SAS code if you ever want that. So just let me know. I've got it on my webpage too. So a lot of people are downloading this and using it. Hopefully it's useful. So what does the decomposition tell us? So like I said, I want those numbers. I want those estimates. We did this for all Mexican Americans. I should probably just delete this column, right? Because there's so many differences between immigrants and second generation that it's not really that interesting. So let's focus on the first column. So these are first generation Mexicans. We know they have very low levels of education. How much does that explain? It explains 80% of the gap in business formation. So this is the number one explanation.
And that speaks exactly to the data of the lack of investment in formal education in Mexico and the communities of origin. Because even though you have a lot of business formation in Mexico, you have very low levels of formal education.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would speak right to that one right there.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's exactly, the story that you were telling earlier. So that's our number one explanation. So almost 80% is just due to one thing, and that's just low levels of education. 12%, another big one, is because they're young, right? Mexican immigrants on average are younger. They come when they're younger. And age is an important factor in determining business formation, that older people are more likely to start businesses. That kind of cumulative experience and maybe, it could be picking up other things like their access to assets and things like that. We also do put in wealth directly, and we find that's a big factor. That's explaining about a third of it. Okay. Now you might notice, well, how do these things add up to more than 100? The decomposition techniques don't restrict that, and so you can always get, you can get numbers that are going to be greater than 100. But one thing that's happening here, this negative number, so it's negative 20%. This is really interesting. This is one of the subtle things that you find from doing these kinds of techniques, is if you were to kind of say, okay, if you gave Mexican immigrants the same level of wealth, the same level of education, and they were older, then Mexican immigrants should be more entrepreneurial than the national population of the U.S. Why? It's because they live in California, they live in Texas, they live in the Southwest, right? These are areas of the country that are growing, that have much higher business formation rates than anywhere else in the country. You think of the Rust Belt cities, those are the lowest business formation cities in states in the U.S. Mexican immigrants don't live there.
Because it's expensive to enter the business, then is there a distinction to the support that's available or not in the region? So even though there's...
I mean, I've done some work looking at the effects of city affirmative action programs, right? So procurement programs, set-asides, programs like that. And there's some evidence that increases business ownership among different minority groups. But not so much on the support, like other types of support, whether or not there's technical training or contract help. I don't know. I haven't seen good data on that. I think that would actually be a pretty hard thing to find.
Yeah.
It's just so
Connected. But there's so many
disconnected. It's not like a federal
fund.
fund.
There is.
There are federal programs, but they're not.
Actually, there's an organization, National Institute of Government Procurement, NGP, back in Virginia, that assists state procurement agencies in exactly, among other things, the type of thing that you're looking at, trying to increase procurement among minority-owned businesses.
Yeah, I should check their webpage.
Minority Business Development Agency, and they have with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they have two real mandates. One is capitalization, one is procurement, and they collect data all the time for their minority business enterprise centers that serve minority enterprises. So they have data as well.
So I wonder, so maybe they do have like an index that tells you how supportive.
Well, maybe the investment in funds to support that.
And there is, to a lesser extent, but it used to be, it's a funny part of the SBA, but it's the advocacy.
Yeah, I know that very well.
The research and advocacy unit of the SBA, and they used to, and I thought they were improving their data collection of small business capitalization, because I think there's a big correlation between the access to capital and the formation of businesses. In all status. So I'm just kind of listening to you. I'm not an economic person. I am a business development person. So when you come to some of the infrastructure related to business development, I know some of those methods.
I've talked to people at the Office of Advocacy, and they don't have like a data set that fits, that has kind of information.
Yeah, it's real, and that's probably why SBA is on the block every time. I don't care what administration
it's always something block.
That's true. Chop them off because their data sets are so horrible. They collect the data, but it's diffuse, and they don't do any analysis of it. But they collect a lot of data. It's just that they don't do anything with it.
Yeah, it isn't being agreed, because I think that's an important component, because I think about, depending on the type of business that you enter, and say you have maybe not the educational attainment, but you have definitely the savviness and the skill set required to hire somebody to do your job that you can't do, that would maintain that. So then the question is, what are for me, what's interesting is to think about what are some indicators that would then inform policy about how to make these mechanisms that would facilitate capital access, that would support these very skilled entrepreneurs who employ. The reason why that matters is because they become employers of their own, and so they're could potentially be job generators. So it would be interesting. So sometimes I wonder how much of it is, like you maybe don't have the literacy, but you have you're very business savvy, and then are you able to understand the requirements also? Well, maybe that's where literacy comes in.
I mean, I think
but
that's
in a different time,
education
and
part.
how you design that.
I think that education is really, that's a big part of it. And we're finding, these big wealth effects, which I think is directly related to capitalism. If there are any kind of liquidity constraints, so you can't borrow freely, which we know is pretty much true, right? You're not going to have perfect access to capital markets, then what happens is your wealth, your home ownership, your equity in your home is going to proxy or maybe be a function of how much you can borrow to start a business. And so that's why lower levels of wealth among Mexican immigrants are restricting their business formation. I mean, that's what we're finding there. And that's a pretty sizable effect, a third of the difference. Mexican second generation, education is also still very important, 21%. But remember, education went up a lot from the first to second generation. So that's why it's not as explaining as much. Second generation is younger, just on average, just in the population and demographics. And wealth levels are still very low. Okay, so another kind of interesting question in the literature is why doesn't first generation to second generation Mexican Americans have more wealth? And you know, the regional differences show up again the opposite way, because Mexican second generation are living in these kind of more rapidly growing entrepreneurial cities.
And yet the second generation is increasing their educational attainment.
Yes,
But
so
they're
that's why
not-
this dropped so much. See how it dropped? Went from 80% of what's going on for the first generation to only 20% in the second. So it's much less of an explanatory factor. Okay. And overall, we're not doing as well explaining all the differences in the second generation. We're doing very well in first generation.
It also doesn't speak to quality of education, right? I mean,
No,
it's not going to do it.
That's true.
But
You
I mean,
can't
a lot
get
of
at that,
people,
unfortunately.
you know, a lot of the Mexican population reside in urban centers and attend urban schools, which are lower performing. That could maybe
That's
speak
always
to that.
big. That's something you just can't measure
Right.
in these types of data sets, unfortunately.
So it seems like the wealth and the education is tracking.
Everything for the first generation.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah, but when you go in the second too, they reduces the wealth has a less of an impact because obviously they have more wealth. I'm assuming that's what
Not a
you're
lot
saying.
more though.
But it's
Yeah.
more. But then you
Yeah.
go down to the third, and then it's more. You know,
Yeah, then it's even
yeah,
less.
it's even more, and then the education is less of an impact as well.
Now, comparing, I think it's interesting to compare these results to African Americans. Education's been noted as an important factor, but you can see it's not even close, right? So all the research that's been done on African Americans, basically education and wealth are the two most important factors, but you can see that there are a lot of unobservable things that are going on here. We do much better explaining what's going on for Mexican Americans, okay? For African Americans, we're doing much worse, right? We're not explaining nearly as well. And there's a much more well-developed literature here. And so there's a lot of talk about consumer discrimination, lending discrimination, and instead of these other factors that could be important.
Are you doing a study on all of the minority groups, not just the study that you're doing? Are you doing some of this comparative? I know you're reporting on.
Yeah.
You study-
So
Yes.
you're studying
So I've
like
done
African
a number of
Americans,
studies on
all
African Americans.
as well.
Yeah.
And do you have in your data set an indicator that shows like where do they get their wealth? Is that from their savings? Is this saved
Not in
for?
these data, but there are other data sets where I've looked at this. A lot of it's kind of personal family savings, which comes back to wealth, right? If you don't have your own personal wealth, it's hard for you to go out and get a bank loan. A bank loan is not a major, it is one of the larger sources of finance, but personal family savings are the most important
To start,
to start a
but
business.
not to grow and expand.
Yeah, we don't know, I don't think we have that information.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good point. I don't.
Yeah, it's to start, but that's why you find a lot of businesses drop out because they can't get the capital to get past the starting phase. You can't expand and grow your
Yeah.
business with your own money for most parts, or the monies that you're just making from your business.
Well, my concern too is that among a lot of these business owners, that they have to rely on their own personal wealth or family wealth. Then they start an undercapitalized business.
Exactly.
They're starting a business that's not at the scale that it should be,
Exactly.
right? To grow and to do well.
And they also start certain kinds of businesses that require low capital.
Yes.
So
That's another-
capitalization
yeah.
of the business. So when you look at the types of businesses that are being formed, they're low capitalization kinds of businesses.
Yep.
service
They're low earnings
industry,
potential
and-
businesses.
And which impacts the revenue generation of the business. When you look at the revenue amounts for the businesses, they're smaller.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm finished.
Without taking you too far off your track, the one thing for later exploration is, I think it's also suggestive that you see a lot of similarities in third generation Mexican Americans and the African Americans, which speaks a little bit to the racialization of both groups. Even independent of the immigration part of it, there's also the racialization part of it, meaning discriminatory practices on the part of financial institutions and redlining and all the stuff that we know about, because often a lot of analyses of Mexican Americans don't take into account their experience as a racial group or a racialized group within this country. The other side of it, that's the column that's not there, are some of the selected Asians that got out of their groups. And the curious thing I have there, I think there is, some of them have higher education levels coming in as the United States with types of education that are similar to U.S. education.
Yeah.
And then the other part is some of them bringing capital from Asia in order to start their business. And in the Mexican case, we have neither the education nor the capital.
Yeah.
Or Central America.
Well, in some work that I've done recently, I've looked at Asian Americans and have found that that's it. Higher levels of education. 50% of Asian business owners have a college degree or higher. Compare that to only about 27% of white business owners and about 20% of black business owners. And I think it's roughly similar for Latinos. It's government data, so I don't know what Mexican Americans would come out at. So very, very educated. And then second, they start businesses with a lot of capital. Much more than white-owned businesses, actually. Much higher levels of startup capital.
And if you look at the sales volume, they're always higher.
Oh yeah, they're more successful on average than white-owned businesses.
By all means.
Yeah. So that's another research project. I can, if you want, I can email you a paper that I've done. Right?
Looking at sort of the Mexican third generation and the African American group, obviously education doesn't seem to be factoring on sort of business formation. Is that something to do with maybe, this could have something to do with discrimination, but that sort of well-educated African Americans might go, pursue jobs, institutions, and corporate structures where they're facing less discrimination than trying to go it on their own in the business world, which might be tougher.
It's possible. I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah, there are a lot of potential explanations there. Any kind of these types of discrimination that other people have found evidence of, they're not going to show up in this kind of decomposition, right? They're going to be kind of this unmeasurable thing that you can't really nail down. But anyway, I should probably move on because I want to show you some of the other. So if you look at this all for women, that table is for men. You find very similar pattern. Education's about 50% of the difference for why first-generation Mexican immigrants have lower business formation rates, and assets are very important, right? About 25%. And you see this kind of drop off, right? Second and third generation, we're explaining less, but we're still explaining a lot of it. And in all cases, we're explaining more than what the previous literature has found for African Americans. So again, education and wealth are the two most important factors for business formation rates for women. We also look at business exit rates, but we get back to this issue that was brought up earlier about what is an exit? Is it necessarily a negative thing? And we find some evidence that education explains 15% of the gap, and wealth explains about 10% of the gap. So we don't put too much emphasis on those results, and these are the results that we put more focus on. And what we do is we take business income, right? So these are the business owners and what their income level is. And what we find is for Mexican immigrants, we can explain about 60% of the difference is due to lower levels of education. So now we're not answering the question about why it is that Mexican immigrants or Mexican Americans in general are less likely to start businesses, but now we're trying to figure out why are the businesses that they do start, that they actually do make it, the fewer of them do make it to start, are not doing as well, okay? Now why are they not doing as well? It's because 60% of it is because their owners are not nearly as educated as the national average. Okay, they have very low levels of education, and another 30% of it is due to this English language ability. So the census data that we use for this part of the study has a question that asks, how well do you speak English? And so what we take is the categories that factor in not speaking English very well, and can look at that, and you can see that that's a really important factor, right? So it's not just education, it's these two forms of human capital that are really important here. And those two together are explaining 80% of the gap. And what's interesting here is we're still explaining a lot for US-born Mexicans. on the education level. Okay, so we're doing well on that. And then what else? For women, you see similar patterns. 70% is due to education differences, and 17% is due to English language ability. And that's also, very high for U.S. born also. So what about industry? Because this seems to be a big issue, right? Is what types of businesses are they starting? One answer to that question is that you shouldn't try to adjust for industry, because we should go back to those previous tables and say, okay, what does the entrepreneur bring to the table when they're thinking about starting a business? Well, it's their skills, their education, their wealth. It's not their industry, right? Industry is a choice they make. And if you're less educated, you have less access to capital, that might force you to start these kind of low earning, low revenue types of businesses. Okay? So we got to be very careful on how we do with industry. So what we did is we just did a couple of things. We looked at the distribution of industries for Mexican immigrants, men versus white non-Latino, and we did it for women also. And what we found for the most part is that for men, the distributions don't look that different, which is a little surprising. We thought they would look more different. So industry really can't explain why it is that these businesses are not doing as well. For women, there definitely are differences. Okay, so you see that Mexican immigrants are more likely to be in this kind of other service category here. So a lot of this is kind of personal services, so 35% relative to 16%. They're less likely to be in professional services. Okay, so they're less likely to be in the high earning service types industries, and they're more likely to be in the kind of lower paying service industries, which could be related to their, well, obviously it's related to their human capital and the wealth that they have to start businesses. But we do find that that does explain part of it. So now legal status. I don't have a lot of time, but I'll go through this relatively quickly. So the Census Bureau and INS estimate that about half the Mexican-born population of the U.S. is here without legal documentation. So they're undocumented immigrants, and you might worry that being undocumented restricts your access to legal institution, government contracts. But on the flip side, it could increase your wages, right? So you're going to be less likely to start a business. You might go and work for an employer. So what we do is a natural experiment. We use the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which granted amnesty, right? It granted amnesty to migrants who were living in the U.S., and they were allowed to apply for legal status if they had been in the U.S. long enough. And what the Legalized Population Survey did, it was done by the Department of Labor, was it interviewed individuals applying for legal status who were all undocumented immigrants, followed them for 4 to 5 years, and then re-interviewed them. So you've got this really nice kind of panel data for a very hard to measure group of the population in the U.S. And what we can do is look at their age at both times. We can look at whether or not they owned a business in both times. We know how many hours they worked. We know a lot of information about them. So what we could do then is we could just say, okay, let's look at their business ownership before they applied for legal status, and then let's look 4 or 5 years later. The problem is that they'll be 4 or 5 years older, which is correlated with how much you own a business. They'll be in the country for 4 or 5 more years. And we know time in the country has a big increasing effect on business ownership. And then finally, macroeconomic conditions might have changed a lot over that period of time. So we have to control for that very carefully. I don't have time to go through it, but we do these kind of synthetic control groups. The bottom line is Mexican immigrants, when they apply for IRCA status, or to get IRCA, to go through IRCA, they were 3% owned a business. Very, very low rate of business ownership. 4 or 5 years later, when they got legal status, it jumped to almost 6%. That's a huge increase over a 4-year period. Get rid of that 4-year growth in their age and how much they're in the country. That gives you from about 3% to 4%. So that's about 1.5%. So subtract that off, and you're left with 1.4%. We did this in many different ways with different data sets, with 3 different data sets actually. Pretty much overkill on this one. But basically, this number is very, very robust. And for women, it's a little lower, but it's still very large. So we're finding that it looks like legal status has a huge positive impact on business ownership. And this, right, because there's so many undocumented Mexicans in the U.S., could be another major limiting factor that, given legal status, they would have higher business ownership rates. So concluding, right, almost exactly in time. So limited financial capital and human capital, those are, the two biggest constraints, right, in terms of business formation and performance. Lack of legal status also is very important for hindering business ownership. And I think a really interesting conclusion from all this research is similar to Asian and European immigrants that are talked a lot about for entrepreneurial ability and entrepreneurship. Mexican immigrants actually would have that same level of entrepreneurship if they had the levels of wealth and education, right? If they had those two factors. They don't, right? But if they did, they would look just as entrepreneurial as immigrants from Asia and Europe. And then finally, one of the things I think is really important for how we kind of started out this talk is these business ownership and performance patterns actually have huge implications for overall income inequality. I did some calculations and I found that if you could take Mexican Americans and bump them up in terms of their business ownership rate to the national average and increase their business earnings to the national average, you could get rid of overall income inequality by about 16 or 17%. So you really could take a big chunk out of overall income inequality if you could just change this one kind of sector, this one part. Okay. Now, the impacts on wealth inequality, of course, could be much larger, as I showed you earlier.
One hard question though: how much of the total of the entrepreneurs? How much does it? How many employees do they have? Like, I'm interested in how much job creation, job generators there are. Give us some. Do you have a?
Yeah, I can't think of the number off the top of my head, but that is the number that you can find.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Robert, for coming to the Center for Latino Policy Research. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I think you gave us a lot to think about. And in particular, I think you leave us with some homework about the design of public policy. But I think it's clear that if we want to design policy that reverses inequality trends and these negative socioeconomic outcomes and want to increase the wealth, then we really need to support education. And we need to think about that in our decision making today with the fiscal crises the budget deficits that we have, and what the outcome is. And also, I think for other kinds of public policies, civic programs that are designed like Selma's program that she runs on business development to account for when we design these programs. It's likely that there could be people that are very savvy, have a lot of business entrepreneurship capacity, but may not understand or know much about the legal structure and or literacy levels or barriers that could need to be taken into account when we design programs that facilitate entry into the marketplace. Because, like you said, this population is growing, they're very young, they're probably very savvy, but the programs are just simply not there to support their advancement. So thank you so much, and we want to invite everyone to continue the dialogue in our reception in the Parlor area.
My name is Selma Taylor, and I'm Executive Director of CARET, California Resources and Training, and we provide support to nonprofit business development organizations throughout the state of California. Very interested in the study, in the information that was presented today related to the variables that impact business formation, business growth, business expansion as it relates to the different ethnic communities in California. As you know, California is a very diverse community, and I think we really need to take a hard look at what's impacting the formation of businesses, what's impacting the existing continuation of existing businesses, how we are attributing and how we are accounting for these variables such as education, such as wealth. So I think that there are questions and how that impact differs among the different ethnic groups, and as well as the length of time of the ethnic groups being in the United States and in different regions of the country. So I think that we really need to look at this from a policy perspective, and as much information as we can gather that will impact policy related to capitalization of businesses, related to developing an infrastructure that will support the growth and development of small businesses. And I think that this report will shed some light on that, and we can work together as a community to address some of these issues.